Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today, I'm joined again by Jack. How are you, mate?
Where else would I want to be, John?
I'm sure there's lots of places you would rather be right now.
No, it's always good. I always enjoy these conversations.
Today, we thought we would go and do a bit of a review episode. There's two reasons for that, because we think that one of the key things that we wanted to look at, given that we've now done more than 100 episodes, which when we started this, I wasn't sure that we would get this far, but we seem to have persevered, which maybe says more about us than it should.
Well, look, and I think this is actually an opportunity to think about, what are we trying to achieve with these podcasts? And
Yeah.
actually, have we achieved it?
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And I think in preparation for this, it made us reflect a little bit about what conversations are the best conversations that we've had and why, and maybe how that relates to our profession, not only as health professionals, but also as particularly physiotherapists, and like what conversations you should be seeking out, because it's really clear that some conversations are very worth having and some others maybe not. So it's interesting to kind of reflect on that. And I don't know if you've got somewhere where maybe we can start with that, but
Well, that's an interesting discussion to have in itself, because I also wonder, are the conversations that we actually enjoy the most the ones that our listeners enjoy the most too?
that's a good question. And obviously we can't answer that for our listeners,
No.
but well, what is it that you enjoy about the conversations that we have? And as we go, maybe you can bring up some examples, because there are probably conversations that people have listened to, and there might be some that people think, oh, I haven't looked at that one for whatever reason. And we personally found them really useful. So, maybe we can steer them in that direction as well.
Well, part of it I also think too begins with, how do you, philosophically, how do you view what we do? And I think the analogy I often think about is, it seems to be this puzzle that continues to expand non-stop, because
When you say we do, you mean
the
podcast, or are you talking about in general?
I'm talking probably more about what I do in my professional work, in that it is this very complex puzzle where we're trying to find more pieces to fit and complete the puzzle.
Yeah.
But at the same time too, you can continue to see that puzzle continues to expand, because I very much take the opinion that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There isn't necessarily a panacea that's going to fix any particular problem that I see.
Totally.
And that obviously goes in, I think, contradiction, which we'll probably talk a bit more about the current sort of theme or narrative of how we're told to do things within our profession.
Well, I think you mentioned the word there, the philosophical position. And I think you and I, one of the reasons that we gel and we work together and we, we're very interested from, our business point of view, is that we have a very similar philosophy, which is that generalists typically are able to explore and come up with better solutions than specialists.
Yes.
Which may actually be quite controversial for some people, because
Yes.
they see in the medical world that there is this drive to have much more of a specialist angle. And I think mine probably comes a little bit more from being almost, unable to concentrate on one thing for a long period of time. And yours probably comes more from curiosity and interest. But neither of us tend to have much interest in sticking with just one area. And even if we are concentrating on an area for a particular period of time, we like to explore outside of that area. And we're talking professionally, at least.
And just to add to that, I think the other thing that you and I have similarities on is we like to understand why something works or how something works. And for me, this is, I guess,
more
almost
than me.
Well, I think you've got a reasonable understanding, and I think it's almost like that reverse engineering concept, where the more you understand about a problem, the more you can see how there are other variables that you can take into consideration to treat a particular problem.
So I think it probably colors very heavily why you would notice as a listener that we speak with people from extremely varied backgrounds. And it's very heavily built on that generalist kind of scope that we think about, because we're looking for opportunities to speak to people who do interesting things and are willing to share their process and maybe how they've been influenced in, achieving success in their, professional pursuits. And, we obviously, for those who, it was only released recently, which will be a few weeks back from this podcast, but, we recently spoke with someone like David Woods. And David we've known for a while, but it was, to me, that was a very interesting discussion. It was completely removed in some areas from our professional practice, but it gave really strong insight into how you can understand the use of the arts and creativity in not only exploring human psychology, but how that then influences the way we behave in different situations. We spoke a lot in that about personas and who you are in this space versus another space. And that, to me, I think very heavily colors how you are as a professional when you're in healthcare.
Yeah, and we touched on this, and I think it's something that you and I have appreciation for, and that is we need to understand our certain psychology and perceptions about how we view our profession and how, and what it is we learn. Because, and I guess we can dive into it a bit now anyway, and we'll come back to it, is we are very much indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking.
Well,
And
even today, for instance, so people, happy to tell people, we obviously recorded multiple podcasts in one day.
of course, yeah.
And so earlier today, we spoke with someone whose background actually, he's a researcher now, but he was a chiropractor. And it's one of those things that, whether you like it or not, in physiotherapy, we often have this interesting knee-jerk kind of pushback on anyone who comes from, particularly other manual therapy or musculoskeletal sort of therapists, whether it be osteopaths or chiropractors, or even, whether they come from a massage background or acupuncture. Straight away, we're very quick to say, no, they're like, what they're saying doesn't carry the same weight as what we're, proposing to be speaking about. And the reality, and this is one of the nice things about the conversations we've had, that's really dispelled a lot of that for me, because we've spoken to some people and you can tell their mission is very similar to ours. It's to try and get the best outcomes that it is they can for patients and understand what we're seeing when we see people present with pain or with injuries. They're not doing anything different to us. They might have a different lens, but it's the same. It's the same objective they're searching for.
Yeah, and like using John, we're referring here to John Sherbel, was that correct?
I think so.
As an example. And my hope is when people listen to a podcast like that we had with him, that they really actually get excited because of, one, the actual very interesting, innovative work that he's doing. But I think the other thing that really stands out about someone like him is he was a clinician.
Yes.
He had a lot of clinical experience and clearly was a very intelligent and curious person who got to the point where he's like, okay, I am seeing certain phenomena here that I cannot explain with the current body of literature and research. And he's probably, I think you and I are similar in that sense, but he's a better person for us because he actually then did the hard yards of going to do the research, which I'm not sure if you or I are have the discipline to do that. But then actually, and it comes from it from that standpoint, because he's come from the standpoint of, I see a phenomenon and I want to understand to solve the problem of what are the mechanisms going on underlying these changes I see within the clinical world.
I think actually this is a good point, because I think this is a thread, and it's not always been the case, but it's a thread of the better conversations we have been with people who are, one, at their core, extremely curious. And they often have been clinicians, and they've then decided, I have questions that I need answered and no one is going to answer them, so I'm going to go and work in that area and find out. The conversations that I think we haven't enjoyed as much have been people who've come from the other, where they say, I'm answering questions that no one asked. And you're like, why are you answering those questions? It's not helping anyone. And in fact, you're confusing everyone because you're making up clinical questions. You're not experiencing something and saying, oh, I can't answer this. I need to go and find the answer. And that, to me, has been the most interesting people. Have always been those ones who've, they're the clinician and they want an answer. We obviously have connections with people like the Stecos, and they're the same. They're clinicians first. Obviously, even our conversation with someone like Tim Gabbett, he's a practitioner, and he made this point. He was, he was probably pretty firm in it, but he said, like, I really don't give a shit what someone who's never stepped onto the field is saying about sports performance. I'm a professional. I work in the field. I had questions. I went to go and answer those questions. I tried to find people who could help me. I went to go and seek that knowledge. if you come to me with, some data that you've collected and you've never stepped into that environment, it's probably not contextually as valuable. And interestingly, I think we've perceived that even in some of the discussions we've had, where sometimes the researchers that we speak with that don't have those dual kind of hats probably haven't been as interesting because they're answering, as I said, questions that no one asked.
Yeah, and this is a phenomenon that I've observed, and using those people as examples, they're the people who have had enough experience, who have enough intelligence and curiosity to go to researchers and go, I have this clinical question. Here are the observations I've made. Here is what I've been able to piece together from what research is available. But I think we need to look more specifically at these questions. And that's very different to the person who's just finished their, undergraduate studies, who
He's unsure what to do, likes research.
who develops a good relationship with a researcher, and they're told, all right, this is what I want you to do. And it's often an extension of their own research, where they don't have the clinical experience. They haven't developed necessarily that breadth of knowledge and haven't been able to come up with their own clinical questions because of that lack of experience. And the reason why I think that's actually really important to highlight, because I think this is something that we see a lot within our profession, particularly considering that so much of the direction of our profession is guided by researchers who very much are often the academic first. And they often are the people who have fallen into a piece of or area of research based on what their supervisors have provided them and are really extending on something that's not their own idea.
Yes.
And I think
because that in itself, I think that's the crux, because you're not necessarily curious about something that's not your interest.
No.
And that in itself is probably a huge motivator, is that, this is an idea that I can't get out of my head. We ask that question at the end of every podcast.
Yes.
And it's always very interesting because as soon as you ask someone who maybe fits into this category, they're looking at something interesting. They're learning a new skill. They're pushing themselves. They're like, I look at this field. I'm trying to work that out, or I'm diving into this. And you ask someone who maybe comes from that other end of the spectrum, and they go, oh, yeah, I'm just living my life and just trying to survive another week, and you're like, okay. It is interesting because I think there is some sort of connection between those two things, as you said, and sometimes when it's your idea, it's very motivating to keep searching.
Yes, and the thing that is evident too in some of the conversations we've had that I've found most interesting is that people who are curious have an understanding of not just what the research says, but trying to make sense of why. And what I mean by that is they start to have an understanding of some of the mechanisms. This goes into, and we can probably argue about how much you need to know about physiology or pathophysiology.
A lot.
But, it seems that the more you have an understanding of some of the cellular or molecular mechanisms, the more you start to see about how there are different types of, say, stimulus or different types of systems that lead to a particular outcome. So, like an example I think of is some of the work by, say like Chris Gaviglio with some of the blood flow restriction stuff, where he obviously had a curiosity and started seeing some very significant benefits from blood flow restriction, and particularly for an intervention which was seen for a very long time of like, you just give that to old people if they're just really low condition, and going, well, hang on a second, this actually creates a very different type of stimulus, yet actually has a very powerful effect on a lot of the adaptations that we are trying to achieve from, say, conventional type of resistance training. And then actually starting to think of, well, with this type of stimulus, what kind of effects do we see on other tissue? Because like we all, it's often thought about muscle hypertrophy, which clearly can have a potential role, but maybe we can actually start to see other benefits because of the fact that it creates a different type of metabolic stress that leads to other cellular adaptations, or how those particular metabolic signals may impact the adaptation of tendon or bone or joint tissue. And then, even then, you can start to think about, well, when you think about metabolic stress, how do other type of stresses like thermal stress influence some of these particular molecular pathways, and can that potentially amplify certain adaptations we're looking for? And it really starts to expand your field. And I think particularly for clinicians or coaches who are like, I want to get the best out of my patients, you want to think about whatever interventions you can do to maximize their outcome.
I think that's the thing that you pick up really quickly, is if you want to maximize, and This is an interesting thing. I actually saw this spoken about in a podcast recently between, for those who listen to someone like Chris Williamson, and it was actually with Alex Hormozy, and they were talking about the difference between optimizers and
But
maximizers.
I actually started listening to this podcast and heard this part. Yes.
And I thought it was really interesting because it probably explains the difference between some of the ways in which people look for even information and try and connect the dots. Some people are looking for the answer, and that's that optimizer. Like, I've got the answer, and then there's other people. It's like, I'll throw the kitchen sink at this because I need the outcome.
You actually just made me think of one other particular personality trait that seems to stand out with people we've had on that I've really enjoyed. Is one, they're very quick to go, oh, actually, like, if we ask them a question that is something that they are unfamiliar with, they're very quick to be like, oh, actually, like, tell me more. Let's explore that further. And more importantly, too, they're willing to try and fit in the gaps. And it's interesting because that's something I often find quite frustrating with researchers when you ask them questions and they might go, oh, well, we just don't have the research for that. And it's like, okay,
Yeah, but
that maybe not, but can you actually start to deduce from your reasoning what may be the underlying mechanisms? Because we definitely have a lot of research about basic sciences. We can probably start to develop some hypotheses, but there almost seems to be a real taboo within our profession, particularly to start making suggestions of things that are outside the typical box of thinking. Yet are actually the important things that allow for innovation.
Mm.
And I think the other thing tied in with that then too, and this works both for researchers, clinicians, coaches, is there has to be some willingness that when you put yourself out there, you may be wrong.
what?
And that can also work in a clinical, I'm sure you can express it from a coaching perspective, meaning that when you set up safe to fail experiments, sometimes it doesn't always work out.
There's a guest. There's a guest that I would like to get on who's a psychiatrist, and I was speaking with them the other day because they're actually someone that comes in and actually sees one of our clinicians. And I was speaking with them about this concept heavily around, the idea of psychological resilience. And I've been on these rants before, but talking about the idea of like adaptation from the application of psychological stresses. And straight away people get scared, but you always have to think about this as stress can be of any magnitude you want. It might be as simple as, you add a little bit of busyness to your schedule so that you get better at organizing yourself. And you see this happen naturally through socialization over time. You go from, and I love this phenomenon. It happens often, I think, when I always talk to young people and I ask them lots of questions about how they're going with school and all of that kind of thing. And I always remember noticing you do year 11 and you go, oh, that's pretty hard. And then you get to year 12 and you go, oh, year 11 was so easy. Then you go to year 12 and then if you go into a reasonably difficult university course, you go, oh, year 12 was so easy. I don't know why I was whinging about how much work. And then you do a master's degree and like, why was I sooking about my undergraduate?
Yeah, for
And
sure.
then you start working and you go, work so much harder. And then
Well, do you ever think about that? I think of back at uni of going, imagine doing uni now, going to an undergraduate.
it would actually be a joke.
Literally.
In terms of how difficult you would find it with your current skill set.
Yes.
And most of that is, as I said, these are psychological and mental framework skills.
Of course. Yeah.
Right? Your ability to manage time, your ability to, complete processes, tasks, meet deadlines, and how many things you can actually just fit in your day. And I always say this, and I'm not a parent, but I always say, like, it's always really impressive to see these people who have children, they laugh when they go, well, have kids and work out how quickly you can organize yourself because it can happen pretty quick.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that gives you the prime example that like the addition of stress is always valuable if it's at the right magnitude, because we've spoken about this so many times, but it's this idea that essentially any complex dynamical system has the ability to adapt. And the only line of communication is stress to that system or perturbation to that system, whatever you want to call it. Right? There are no other communication pathways that work. So you can either keep the stress level the same, and we spoke about that concept that I mentioned to you, like that almost entropic kind of behavior that occurs with the maintenance of that level of perturbation. You can have a reduction, which is going to cause that system to downregulate its requirements, or you can have an addition of a stressor or the magnitude of that stressor, and that's going to cause an upscaling. Now, if that magnitude is too high, it can cause complete failure. But these are the things that I think that you need to consistently be thinking about, because we have no other option but to add some form of stressor to that
Well,
system.
and then I'm just again thinking about drawing correlations to interesting people we've had on, the best conversations we've had on, is one, particularly for researchers, the researchers who actually go into multiple fields.
Yes.
Because that's hard. That's
Very
hard, both from the standpoint of it, I imagine, would take up a lot more time. And it seems that a big thing for researchers is just publish, publish, publish. But also then to moving outside of areas that you're comfortable with.
Yes.
And the other thing I see too is...
Sorry,
go on.
so no, because you made a perfect point. The only way to do it, as I said, is to add stress. And we've spoken a million times about this idea of safe to fail experiments. But the word that's key there is fail. That system needs to, whatever it is, it can be a psychological thing or whatever it is, it could be a physical, you need that system to diminish in its capability before it will adapt, because otherwise it's not enough stress to that system to create a stimulus for growth.
Yes.
It actually needs to be hard. Now, how big you make that failure is up to you. If you do too big, you're probably at risk of damaging the structure overall. But we need to build into our mindset that there is no way forward except through failure. And you mentioned before, those people, this is the tying it all together, the people that are interesting are the ones who are willing to be wrong as often as they can. Now, they don't want to be so wrong that they've bet
question their whole life's work. Yes.
They've bet their livelihood on this one answer. But they're very happy to have micro failures in their knowledge.
Of course.
Oh, I don't know anything about that. Tell me about that. Oh, actually, I need to reconceptualize how I see that problem. They're not taking it as a detrimental and life-ending failure. They see it as this opportunity for growth. And the reason that it is the only opportunity for growth is we cannot learn unless we extend ourselves beyond our current capabilities. And in itself, that is a failure.
Yes. And to extend on that, that's something that's very evident when you look at researchers who I think stay in their own echo chamber.
Yeah.
And often will only reflect on their own research or research that's they've only been exposed to or agrees with them. And I was just going to say, to add to that, of the people you meet who collaborate then with other researchers who may not necessarily always align with the same belief systems. And again, I think of, just because we did it more recently, we've interviewed, say, Antonio Stecco. We recently interviewed John Sherbel, and they have been doing some collaborations, which John talked about. Now, they obviously are both interested in the same field, myofascial pain. But in terms of some of the mechanisms underlying what they think contribute to it, there are differences between the two. But what they've actually done is collaborated to go, well, let's put together a model that actually includes this different opinions.
And he mentioned that. He mentioned how they've done this review paper that's about to come out, and it's a collaboration of all of their ideas. They're trying to find that and navigate. I've spoken about that idea of the golden path. They're trying to find the truth, and they're trying to say, okay, I'm coming at it from this angle, you're coming at it from that angle. How do we get onto a path that we think is the right direction to get better outcomes for the people that we work with?
Yeah, and look, I think for me, at least personally, it helps you to make sense then too of going, well, I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all approach.
Not at all.
And it's very evident clinically that you may see two people present with similar types of problems that have very different prognoses or management plans to get them better. And this is reflective of the fact that whenever you start to learn more about a phenomenon in a complex system, i.e., a musculoskeletal injury or pain, you start to realize that often there are multiple mechanisms or causes. And actually, more often than not, these different mechanisms or causes interact with each other. And then really starts to expand your understanding of, okay, well, this is why this intervention seems to have a bigger effect on this individual, or why modifying these particular variables with this intervention, whether it's manual therapy, exercise, whatever it could be, seems to elicit potentially a larger benefit in reducing pain or improving their performance, as an example. And it's only through expanding your knowledge by exposing yourself to different ideas and building upon looking at the basic science to build up an understanding of key principles associated with a particular pathology or from a performance standpoint, that, okay, there's a lot more things I need to consider than just a simple thing of,
Well,
I give someone isometrics with
I always find it
tendinopathy.
funny because I sit there in some of the podcasts and all I'm doing is thinking is like, how can I use this?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, I like this idea. How can I use it? I
Yes.
want to use this. Um, I think that that's a key thing, that as soon as you find something that you might have some benefit, I always find that I'm attracted to wanting to sort of experiment with it. And I think that openness is something that you see not only there's people seeking knowledge, but also the people using the knowledge.
Oh, and look, one of the reasons why we started this podcast is because we're interested to expand our own knowledge and
Yeah.
obviously then share that with our listeners because, well, we hope that we're on the same journey of like, look, we're just here to try and get better. And it's very evident when the conversations that we have when you're stopping and thinking about, okay, this is interesting, as opposed to, okay, this is just a regurgitation of the same narrative I've heard from many other people.
I wanted to ask you because I think there's something interesting, and we spoke about this actually from a business sense recently, which was this idea of people who get attached to process versus the people who get attached to outcome.
Yes, yeah.
And we've had some really interesting people on. Like, I think back to, say, for instance, the coaches. I think back to someone like Justin Rinaldi. And, the first question I said was, how do you get someone to run
800 meters and
144 for the 800? We said, well, you run 51 for the first lap and you run 53 for the second lap. And it's such, I know that he knows this, but it's such a brilliant and beautiful and eloquent way of saying there is an outcome, and your job is to find a way of getting there, right? And it was just such a beautiful answer.
Well, and the thing I think of straight away then too, John, and again, this is a criticism I think for a lot of people out there who may be
criticizing everyone, Jack.
Maybe pushing a particular way of how we treat things, is it's the pursuit to intellectually justify that you're right, as opposed to the outcome of like, well,
didn't get the outcome.
No, exactly. Yeah. So, like, who cares about what you necessarily do? If you get a good outcome, isn't that the most important thing?
I think, unfortunately, though, there is a little bit of, and we've spoken about this so many times, but that unwillingness to give up, say, the mechanistic understanding because they want to fit into this idea of evidence-based practice. And I think,
which we've talked so many times about this before.
But I think I agree with you. I think the big thing that you have to kind of be open to is, if you are getting a particular outcome and you know that it works, your job is not to say, I'm not going to use it because I don't know the mechanism. It's like, go and find what that mechanism is that's working.
And then when it doesn't work, understand why too. Because the reality is, your failures are where you learn the most.
Well, I see this with coaching a lot. Like, I go through this experience over and over and over. And there's times that I think with my coaching where I got results that I don't actually, like, looking back on it, I didn't know what I was doing. Right? It happened because of a certain culmination of circumstances. And when I actually tried to replicate it, I couldn't.
Yes, yeah.
And it took me a long time to be able to go back and understand what was driving that. And understanding the mechanism further down the track and trying to work out, okay, what was driving that? What was the main features? What were the principles underlining that were really, really key things, and that's what led to.
And what contextual factors led to that good outcome in that circumstance?
So for people who are kind of like, I'm speaking vague generalities, like, this was very much the foundations of the discussion that we had about, the addition of ongoing stress to a very mature sort of athlete in terms of their training history, and seeing if you don't keep creating a stimulus for them, they will go backwards even though you're doing the exact same thing. And I got really confused with that initially because I just couldn't work out, we're doing what we're doing. And from a biomechanical standpoint, it's meeting the requirements. But the reality was, the first time that I exposed them to it, or the first few times, that was a stimulus. Later on, it wasn't.
Actually, the thing I just think about then too, and it's like the example you gave of Justin Rinaldi's response to how you run an 800 and 144 is, I think we like to try and find simplicity or, simplicity. But there's always seems to be a very fine line between like, okay, it's pretty straightforward. This is what you do versus, okay, well, that doesn't actually necessarily work in the real world. And like, I guess in that idea of working with complex adaptive systems that are, that is characteristic of humans.
To me, what he did there and what he articulated, and this is like I always these days I try to work out what is the principle.
Mm,
You know, we obviously had Tom Templeton on again recently. We're talking about strength and conditioning, and he and I have lots of discussions about training, about sports performance, and we're always just talking about, what actually is that person doing? Because everyone thinks they've come up with a new idea, but most of the time they haven't.
no.
Right? It's something that they've adapted or copied, or they're not even aware that someone else has done it. And the question you always have to ask yourself is, it looks like that's working. Why is that working? What is the principle that's driving that? And it might be, as you said, contextual to that population they're dealing with. Like if it's an untrained individual, this is why, the research say on training periodization is mostly horseshit, because they get sports science students, most of them who haven't trained or aren't that athletic. You could apply any training to them,
Of course.
and it's going to improve their performance. Doesn't matter what methodology you use, because all the body knows is this is their current capability, and you're adding the stressor that's higher magnitude than their current capability. And so it goes, oh, well, I better get better. And as long as you don't overdo it in terms of the magnitude of that stressor, it's not going to break them down. They'll get better.
And to extend on that, of doesn't necessarily need to be that specific to begin with when the system isn't that mature.
No.
Well, we go on.
No. So what the thing that I think about when we say something like what Justin mentioned is he's clearly worked out from a very, very basic point of view, what are the key KPIs that I need, right? And it's actually very interesting because you can break it down really easily.
That's a good point.
And the way you break it down really easily, you say, okay, it seems like he's being a bit of a smart aleck, and it seems like he's actually oversimplified it. But what he actually has done, which is extremely clever, is he's worked out, okay, they need to be able to run the first lap in 51. So what does that tell you from a principal's point of view? You need to have a significant amount of speed to be able to run 51 seconds for a 400 and actually be very comfortable, because you've got to do another lap. So most people will want to run the first lap, right, somewhere between 3 or 4 seconds slower than their personal best or their current season's best.
Yep.
So what does that tell you? And some people will push it closer if they're really well conditioned to it, right? But if it's 3 seconds, that means at absolute worst, you should be able to run 48 flat for the 400 at that point, right? So that tells you a lot. It's like, okay, you need speed if you're going to run a fast 4. Fast 8. The second thing is you need to be able to run 53 when you're already tired. So what does that tell you? That tells you that you need to be able to maintain your speed or the speed output under a huge amount of fatigue. Really, that is the foundation of something like 800. Build people's speed, build their ability to do it efficiently, and then build the ability for them to be able to hold that under enormous amounts of fatigue. They're the key KPIs. They're probably the 3 main track sessions they do. They'll do other supportive sessions, but that's probably the 3 key track sessions that they might do. And straight away, you realize how intelligent what he said is, even though it comes across as an oversimplified, smart answer to a question that is a very difficult problem. And that is the thing that I think the really, really switched on people do, is they can elucidate what's the key things here? What are the key factors that I need to do? And this relates, you mentioned before in complex systems, this relates so much to this idea of what are the key modulators in the system? What are the big rocks? Because you can have a complex system where there's thousands of inputs, but most of them are not key modulators. They're modulators.
They're 0.1%ers,
What are the big rocks? And like a big rock is, if you can't run fast enough, say if your PB for 400 is 52 seconds, well, there's no chance you can run 51 for the first lap. It's just not possible.
And actually, this is a good example, I think, to make between certain guests we've had on, like coaches working with elite athletes versus certain researchers. And the example I want to give is using, say, Just as an example. He has worked with the pinnacle
Yeah.
of
He had
athletes.
an athlete finish 4th at the Olympics.
He understands what is capable of individuals, and he understands that although there is complexity, you can boil it down to
Some
certain
key
key performance
modulators. Yeah.
indicators. And I shift that to researchers and research, because the thing that I also find sometimes frustrating is research is to give you an indication of averages. And I think about something like back pain, and we've had plenty of people on to talk about back pain. And some researchers would say, well, most back pain, it's non-specific. If someone's got back pain for more than 6 weeks or whatever it is, it's chronic and the prognosis is poor. And here's what we give as a general recommendation. I, as a clinician, go, okay, that tells me that if I apply this basic intervention, that's the gold standard, I can expect a pretty poor outcome. And me as a clinician, I want to go, well, hang on. I want to work on the individual level to go, I don't want that someone to be in the average. I want someone to be in this end of the spectrum. I want them to have a good outcome. I want them to see a reduction in pain. I want them to see an improvement in their performance or getting back to activities they want to do. So then that changes my mindset of going, okay, I know what to expect if I apply this. What are other pieces of the puzzle that I can find in the research or from clinical experience to shift, going from not being in the average to seeing an exception? And that's something I think that's very evident in particularly some of the coaches or clinicians we've worked with, who clearly have that curiosity to go, my plan or my expectation is to get someone to have this outcome. Where do I start to draw an understanding of what's missing from the general recommendations to see an improvement from what would typically happen in that particular population group?
Mm.
And to be fair, I think you see that also in researchers too, because good researchers, it seems, or at least the interesting ones that we've had on, are the ones that are trying to see, well, where are the gaps within not only the research itself or how it's done, but actually with our understanding of this problem. And like, obviously for me personally, a lot of my interest and curiosity has come in understanding fascia's role in myofascial pain or musculoskeletal pain, and seeing that actually can draw a lot of the gaps within our knowledge of understanding things like non-specific pain. And I think that's a really useful thing to consider too, because research gives us an indication of the average, but we as clinicians or coaches are working on an individual level to see how we optimize the outcome for n equals 1, so to speak.
Yeah. Or the other thing is, and I think this is where people like Louise Burke were fantastic, and she was saying, like, embedded research is
Yep.
probably the pinnacle for most people. It's like you go into an environment of a subset, and obviously it's specific to that subset, but they're going out and embedding themselves and making sure that they can get an understanding of what happens when you put in place an intervention. And I really I don't think most people, and if you haven't listened to the podcast with Louise Burke, go and listen to it. And I know that we were very forward in praise, and especially I was, because I don't think most people understand how much humility it takes for someone of Louise's knowledge and understanding to say, I'm going to go into this environment, say with the study they did with walking and fat adaptation, and I'm going to do everything I can to try and prove a hypothesis for something that I don't recommend.
Mm.
Like, to me, the level of intellectual humility to do that, and to the extent that they tried to prove that it could be possible, shows how much she, as a practitioner, not even as a researcher, as a practitioner, is committed to trying to get good outcomes for, obviously these were walkers, right, at the elite level. She's saying, I don't care what my research previously has said. I don't care what my own personal ideology on this, based on the research I've done or the knowledge that I have, is. I'm going to see if this works, because it's more important to me to see if we can help these athletes get better than it is for me to tell people I'm right and keep proving that over and over. So that, I think, in itself is such a big reflection of people's capability and understanding of what's important. And often it is searching out how to find the outcome that is better for the people they're working with and not for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking, is there anything else you want to touch on, John, just before we finish up?
Well, I think that we initially mentioned, and I think this is important, is what does this mean as a clinician and as a physiotherapist? Like, what can we take from some of these talks that we've done and some of the people that we uh, have learned from so that we can actually be able to, you know, further ourselves? Because I feel like you and I, very selfishly, but also very gratefully, have gotten a lot out of these discussions. You know, like, I think it's always funny because I think both of us are very proud of the knowledge that we have, but I actually really enjoy often having these discussions and realizing, oh, I don't understand very much
Mm,
about
mm,
this. You know, I was very, very um, grateful that even one of our guests who we did a fantastic talk with, and he's obviously a long term colleague of ours, Adam Bryan, invited me to a meeting with some researchers recently, and I was sitting there and I was smiling, and one of the other researchers who was there said, you know, he just looked at me and he goes, what's funny? I said, I'm actually enjoying how much I don't understand what the hell's being spoken about right now. You know, some of these people, a lot of them were quite sort of high level engineers, and they're talking about computer modeling and simulations and things, and they're talking about the way in which they do this with their data. And I actually had no idea, particularly some of the terminology. I was following what was going on, but it was really interesting. I was like, wow, okay, this is so humbling, but this is so enjoyable. And it's that saying, I don't know where it comes from, but it's like, you never want to be the smartest person in any room. And that is so true. And I think that's one of the things that I've taken from the discussions we've had is, and I think both you and I personally take some disappointment when we have a guest on and we go, yeah, we learned nothing from them,
yeah.
right? Because selfishly, we want to be the dumb people
Oh,
in the room. We want to be
well,
sitting there going, "Oh shit."
you know what I actually like is, sometimes you think of, hey, I'll ask this good question, and you ask it, and the person gives you a response of going, you're asking me a question at this level. I'm sort of thinking at this level. And you go, right, I've probably got a few more steps to go before I get to your level. Um, but look, the
So,
thing I see the purpose of this podcast for us and our listeners is it's really meant to be a spark or a
yeah,
catalyst, because and I think we do a pretty good job of trying to actually get people from different backgrounds with different knowledge to be able to spark different ways of thinking. But I think it's really important to understand that that is just the starting point, because part of it is to, one, probably go away and learn more about that particular topic or about that particular person. But then two, to actually start tinkering of going like, well, what do they do? Or how does that actually influence what I program, or how I view this particular problem? Because ultimately, I think with having good curiosity, you're continually tinkering, or, collaborating with other people to go like, oh, look, I'm a physio, you're a chiro, you've got this particular knowledge and background. I'm actually interested to actually learn how you view this particular problem, to see what you take from it. And like, there may be times where you agree or disagree, but part of that is actually about building up your own understanding of how you view that particular problem. And that can be related to, I want to learn about these particular manual therapy techniques, or I want to learn more about running in this particular type of model for running assessment, or this type of particular periodization or programming that you do. And then part of the other, I think, of that too, is how when you come across interesting research and people, you start to learn more about some of the basic sciences that then takes you down the path of understanding some of those mechanisms to go, oh, okay, well, what happens with this particular variable, and how does that influence the changes in that particular response?
mm,
And part of that is then also then playing it clinically and going, well, that didn't work, or that actually was interesting but didn't have the result I actually wanted.
yeah, I think you're 100% right. I think that for most people in the, and I say in healthcare space, I think the things that we keep learning from these discussions is, you know, about being open, is about,
Well,
you know, wanting to explore new ideas, being curious, and being committed to trying to get good outcomes, because
mm,
that seems to be one of the common threads. You know, whether it's as a health professional, whether it's as a sports performance coach, you know, if you're there to get good outcomes in a non-selfish manner. You're not looking for your own benefit. It seems to be a common thing that leads to people getting good outcomes is they're not searching for it for their own benefit.
No, and a big part of that is about realizing that we all have egos
Oh yeah.
and getting out of our echo chambers, and like,
Well, actually, here's a question for you.
go on.
Who are there any podcasts that made you question yourself more than you thought you would? Like, is there any that you would go back and listen to and you go, "Oh, I actually really was challenged there. Like, it was really uncomfortable for me to be able to listen to this because it challenged my perception of that issue or that problem or that topic."
I can't think of one off the top of my head. I'll get back to you on that. Well, I think actually one that really stood out to me in terms of just something that I'd thought about but had very little knowledge on was actually one I did by myself with Jacques Corso, the medical doc over in New Orleans. Is that how you
New
pronounce it?
Orleans, yeah.
New Orleans.
Don't say New Orleans though.
No,
They'll know you're not from there.
Yeah. And the work that he's done, which is very pioneering work of looking at some of the genetic polymorphisms associated with hypermobility. And for those of you who haven't listened to it, I would highly recommend listening to him and looking at his research. He has published a paper on it because this is something that you and I have talked about. This is something that I think a lot of people at least appreciate the idea of, say, nutrigenomics, i.e., the relationship between nutrition and genetic expression, and then how that then influences particular musculoskeletal types or myofascial profiles like hypermobility, and thinking, well, is the limiting factor here maybe not related to the mechanical stimulus I'm applying, but some of the nutritional status of that individual? And it seems very evident that that is such an important thing to consider. And we could extend not just on nutrition, but thinking about systemic health. And I know for me personally, because it was the same for you and I when we were at uni, is like we got taught the biopsychosocial model, and we know that there are different systems, both physical and non-physical, that influence someone's state. But it was kind of this very vague, non-specific model of like, oh, you've got to consider someone's, psychology. And it's like, which, I mean, I'm not saying you don't, you absolutely do. But there's actually very well understood mechanisms for how these things influence musculoskeletal problems. And the diet stuff, I just feel like we're only just scratching the surface of understanding its importance in maximizing outcomes.
But yeah, that reminds me, I think we've got to search out a couple of people because obviously things like, microbiome is
Absolutely.
a massive area.
Yeah.
I think we actually should look into, and a big area that I started looking into it at a very brief level was, the idea of psychobiotics.
Yes.
And I think it's something that we probably should actually explore a little bit more.
Yeah. Is there any for you in particular, John?
I don't know any that necessarily. There's been some ones that I've really enjoyed, and as in parts they extend you because you're like, okay, I don't really understand these mechanisms that well.
Are there any ones actually for you? Because you obviously have a big part of what you do is coaching as well, and we've obviously had a lot of coaches. Which, for when we talk to them, I do get stuff out of it too. But you probably have much more an ability to directly infer what that does to your coaching. Have you ever had any coaches where it's really challenged what you do, or maybe even more importantly too, you've thought, no, I disagree with that, but have maybe changed your mind on over time?
Oh, I've changed my mind a lot. I don't know
Yeah.
if it's necessarily from a particular coach. Like, what I always do, as I said to you, and it's something that I notice in the people that we speak with, and I think it's something that I try and do as much as I can, is I try and work out why things work, right? Because the result you're looking for is, do they get people to run well? And if they do, then it's like there has to be a reason for it or some sort of background to it. And so I spend a lot of time trying to work that out. And often, obviously, for a lot of the guests we've had on, especially the coaches, I know them. So
you have conversations with them all the time.
I've already had that thought of like, okay, well, why do they get success? What is the things that they do well? And I try, like, I'm not going to lie, I steal things all the time that I think are useful.
Well, actually, it's funny. People do say steal. I think of originality is so individual in that sense. Like you doing something for the first time is original, and it helps you to understand what works and what doesn't work, even though I'm sure plenty of other people have done it in the past.
Mm.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say necessarily anyone's made me completely change my mind. I think you're always evolving, and I feel like it's one of those things too. If your practice isn't evolving, then you're probably not doing it right. I don't know. Is that
Well,
is that fair?
it actually, you just talk about it like, why do we do this podcast? It's like, because I don't want to get bored.
Yeah, I want to keep evolving. I
Yeah,
want to keep
absolutely.
developing knowledge. In terms of the podcasts that I've really enjoyed, there's been heaps of them, but like I really enjoyed the one with John Hawley. I thought he was so personable. I thought Louise Burke was fantastic.
Um,
Obviously, they're husband and wife.
I mean, we're always going to probably have a bit of recency bias because we've done quite a few now. But I think of Sarah O'Reilly Harbidge, the
She was fantastic.
surgeon.
Obviously, she was quite recent as well. But even, like as I said, I really enjoyed. There's been a number of surgeons that we've had on. I really enjoyed our talk with Julia Kirby. I thought she was very open
Yeah,
and honest
absolutely.
with us about, where practice is at and, and what we could get out of that. We obviously had some really fantastic ones on a number of different, where we had biomechanists and there's just been a number of one that stands out as well, and it wasn't that long ago, was, David Bem.
Actually, Avish, I also really enjoyed the conversation with
Yeah,
Avish.
yeah, Avish was fantastic as well.
And a good example of someone who really has a good understanding of the science.
Well, with him, and he's a perfect example of this as a professional. Obviously, he has his PhD that is in, heat and altitude acclimatization, and he did that through the AIS. But his role, and it's funny because everyone says, "Oh, he's an exercise physiologist," but as he said to us, I'm not actually an exercise physiologist. I'm a performance scientist, and that lends itself to that breadth. To that breadth of understanding. So, yeah, he was fantastic to have on, and obviously because I know him reasonably well, and we could be a little bit more personable. I feel like we were able to get some, quite honest answers from him about where performance sits and where it doesn't.
I'm actually about to say, I feel like we should look over all the guests we've had, because I'm sure there'll be some ones that when you sparks your memory, you go, that was actually fantastic.
There's been lots of fantastic ones. I think for people who are interested, if you have made it this far in this podcast and you want some ideas on which podcast might be useful for you to listen to learn, and it's on a particular topic, reach out to us, because I think that there is opportunity for us to say, okay, if it's on running, there's a whole series of coaches and a whole series of discussions we've had with either myself or Sam or
the other one I
Tom.
actually think of is it's John Madison, isn't it? The hormesis stuff?
No,
It's Madison, I'm sure.
no, I don't believe it's John Madison.
You keep talking. I'm going to quickly look it up.
That one was fantastic.
Yeah, it was very good.
That was one of the best ones we've done, actually, to be honest with you. We did some really good ones when we were recording it at your place, Jack.
Maybe we should go back to that, John.
I don't know if it was the environment or what it was, but it was they were some of the best ones that we did.
Mark Matson.
The one with Mark Matson was fantastic. And the other one that was fantastic.
Actually, it's a good. I looked it up after maybe review it. The hormesis principle of neuroplasticity and neuroprotection.
Mark Matson was fantastic. The other one that was fantastic, and it actually got cut short, which was Sophia Nymphius.
Yeah.
She was so good, and she's another. I think she's another one of these people who very much is interested in trying to work out how to help people in a contextually specific way. And she's just a curious person, and she's knowledgeable. And when we brought up things with her that she maybe wasn't that aware of, she was so open to saying, "Oh, that's really interesting," and like, I want to know more about that. Tell me about it. So Sophia Nymphius was a fantastic podcast. Yeah, we've been really lucky. So anyway, obviously we've been waxing lyrical about what we've been doing. If there are questions that you have, or there's something, the topic that you want us to seek out, or even a professional that you would like us to speak with, do pass on that information. We do get communications from time to time from people, but we're very open to speaking with people more about how we can extend the conversation across different areas. So overall, thank you for joining us, and don't hesitate to reach out to us.